Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling something I never really thought about, taming wild horses.
Oh,
We're
yeah.
going to be looking at, excerpts actually from a book that was published way back in the 1800s called The Art of Taming and Training Wild Horses. I have to admit, when I first saw this title, I thought, well, this is going to be some rough and tumble cowboy tactics.
Right.
But the author takes this, surprisingly philosophical approach,
Yeah.
really emphasizing a humane connection with the animal.
Yeah, it is, it's fascinating, isn't it? And the book really dives into understanding the horse's nature. And honestly, some of these insights might surprise you.
So what's the mission for today? What should I be looking out for as we're exploring these excerpts?
Well, by the end of this deep dive, you'll not only understand this unique philosophy, but you also walk away with some practical tips for building trust and communication with horses. And you might be surprised how relevant some of these 19th century ideas are, even today. Not just for handling horses, but maybe for approaching any relationship where you need to build trust.
Right. I'm intrigued. But before we get into the techniques, maybe we should set the stage a bit. I mean, horses have been part of human history for ages. But it wasn't always a smooth ride, was it?
Not at all. I mean, think about it. For centuries, humans used other animals for labor before we turned to the horse. Oxen, donkeys, camels, they were probably easier to domesticate, right?
Mm-hmm.
A little less intimidating to those early humans.
Yeah, that makes sense. Horses are powerful creatures, I can imagine.
Yeah.
Those first encounters being pretty intense.
Oh, absolutely. And those early riding experiences, they were far from the romantic image we often have. Imagine trying to ride a horse bareback without a bridle for centuries.
Wow.
And get this, mounting was originally done from the right side, not the left.
From the right side, why on earth would they do that?
Well, it's thought to be linked to carrying swords. Most people were right-handed, so mounting from the left would have been awkward, with a sword dangling on that side.
Ah,
And speaking of awkward, they even use servants as mounting blocks. Can you picture that?
wow. That's
Yeah.
very humane. It sounds like early horsemanship was. Not exactly a walk in the park.
No kidding. It took ages for saddles and bits and even ladies' side saddles to evolve. Progress was definitely not a straight line.
Right. It really makes you appreciate how far we've come
Yeah.
in understanding and working with these animals. But back to our 19th century horse whisperer. He lays out these three core principles for taming horses, right?
That's right. And these aren't just random tips. They're based on a deep understanding of the horse's nature. He really emphasizes working with their instincts, not against them.
Okay, I'm all ears. Let's break down these principles. What's the first one?
The first principle is obedience. Now, before you think this is all about turning horses into mindless robots, let me explain. The author recognizes that horses don't have our complex reasoning abilities. They don't rebel out of spite. They react based on what they understand.
So it's more about clear communication, but on their terms.
Precisely. If they truly grasp a command, and it's delivered in a way that respects their instincts, they'll follow it willingly.
That's interesting. It almost sounds like a leadership philosophy. More than just horse training. What about the second principle?
The second principle is unconscious strength. And this one really highlights how differently horses experience the world compared to us. A colt, for example, isn't born knowing just how strong it is. That awareness comes with experience. And this is key to handling them without resorting to brute force.
I'm guessing this is where those examples about halters and hitching posts come in.
You got it. The book talks about how to use halters and hitching posts in a way that minimizes their struggle. Imagine a young horse tied to a hitching post for the first time. They might pull back, not out of defiance, but simply because they don't yet understand the limits of their own strength.
So instead of forcing a confrontation they don't even understand, it's about gently guiding them.
Exactly. It's about working with their lack of self-awareness, not punishing them for it. And this ties in beautifully with the third principle, overcoming fear.
Okay, fear is a big one, especially when you're dealing with a large, powerful animal. What's the author's take on that?
Well, he believes that fear in a horse usually stems from the unknown. His approach is all about letting them safely investigate scary objects, using all their senses, especially touch. He even gives this great example of a horse being terrified, of a robe hanging in a barn.
I can imagine a horse thinking that robe is some kind of monster, lurking in the shadows.
Right. But the author emphasizes letting the horse sniff the robe, touch it, figure it out. Once they've explored it with their senses, the fear just melts away. It's like they have to prove to themselves that it's not a threat.
It's like that saying, fear of the unknown is greater than fear itself.
Yeah.
Once they understand what it is, it's no longer scary.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting. Because this principle applies to us humans, too. How often do our own fears come from not fully understanding something?
That's a great point. It seems like this author isn't just talking about horses. He's talking about understanding how all creatures, including humans, react to the world. But let's get back to the horses. We've covered the three principles, but I'm dying to know how this translates into practical taming techniques. Where do you even begin with a wild colt?
Right?
So we've talked about the philosophy, but now let's get down to the nitty-gritty. How do you actually approach a wild colt for the first time? I imagine it's a delicate dance.
You're absolutely right. It all starts with patience. The author suggests thinking like a hunter stalking prey. Slow, deliberate movements, no sudden noises. You want to avoid triggering that flight instinct.
So no chasing them down like in the movies?
Definitely not. The idea is to slowly acclimate them to your presence. He also mentions how mimicking natural herd behavior can help. For example, if you lead a calm, experienced horse into the stable first, the wild colt might follow, out of curiosity or a sense of safety.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. They're naturally drawn to their own kind. Okay, so let's say you've managed to get the colt into a stable. What's the next step? How do you even begin to handle them?
This is where the author's deep understanding of horse psychology really shines through. He stresses the importance of using a well-fitted leather halter. In fact, he goes on a whole rant about the dangers of rope halters.
I have to admit I was surprised by that. Rope halters seem pretty standard these days. What's the issue with them?
Well, think about it from the horse's perspective. A rope halter can tighten and pinch if they pull back, which just panics them even more. A leather halter, on the other hand, distributes pressure more evenly and gives them a chance to figure out that they're not trapped. It's like the difference between being grabbed by a tight fist versus a gentle hand.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So it's about giving them a sense of control, even within the boundaries you're setting?
Exactly. And he gives very specific instructions for the haltering process itself. Minimize pulling, offer plenty of slack in the lead rope, and never make them fight the halter itself. It's about subtle communication, almost like a dance of pressure and release.
So much thought goes into every interaction. This is a far cry from the rough handling you often see. Okay, so you've got the halter on. What about actually getting them used to being touched and handled?
This goes back to that third principle we talked about, overcoming fear. You see, the author actually challenges the common belief. That smell is a horse's dominant sense. He makes a compelling argument for touch being the most important one for them.
Really? I always thought horses relied heavily on their sense of smell. Why does he emphasize touch so much?
Think about how horses interact with the world. They're constantly touching things with their noses. It's their way of investigating, gathering information, almost like we use our hands.
That's such a good point. I never thought about it that way.
Yeah.
So how does this understanding of touch influence his training methods?
He stresses the importance of gentle strokes, always following the direction of the hair. It's about building trust through physical contact, letting them get used to your touch.
So lots of petting and positive reinforcement. Is that all it takes?
Well, here's where it gets a little more complex. The author also recognizes the power of fear. Now, before you think he's advocating cruelty, let me clarify. He's talking about a healthy dose of respect for the handler, especially when dealing with a potentially dangerous horse.
That seems a little contradictory to all the gentleness we've been discussing. How does he reconcile those two ideas?
It's all about balance. He believes that a horse needs to understand boundaries, and sometimes that involves a certain level of fear. Or perhaps respect is a better word. But it's never about punishment. For example, he explains how to use a whip effectively. But it's all about communication and setting clear expectations, not inflicting pain.
So it's like saying, I'm in charge, but I'm not going to hurt you. It's about establishing leadership through clear communication and boundaries.
Exactly. And he always emphasizes balancing that with love and positive reinforcement, lots of caresses, a soothing voice, and consistent rewards for good behavior. It's about being a fair and trustworthy leader, not a dictator.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So what are some of the specific techniques that he outlines? I'm especially curious about the one you mentioned earlier, the 1 foot up technique.
Yes, that one definitely raises some eyebrows. It's surprisingly effective for handling wild or potentially dangerous horses. Basically, you fasten one of the horse's front legs, bending it at the knee, so they're standing on 3 legs.
Wait, you actually tie up one of their legs. That sounds a bit extreme.
It does sound strange, I'll admit. But think about the principle of unconscious strength. By limiting their ability to kick or rear up, you're actually helping them to relax. They realize they're not in a position to fight, so they surrender to the situation.
I guess it makes sense. It's like they're forced to confront their own limitations. Does it actually work?
The author swears by it. He claims that within 10 minutes or so, the horse will usually lie down, either out of exhaustion or a sense of giving up. And that's when the real training begins.
What happens once they're down? I imagine they're not too happy about being in that position.
That's the surprising part. Once they're lying down, they seem to enter a state of complete submission. You can handle their legs, touch them all over, things they might never have allowed before. It's like they've let go of their resistance and are finally open to your guidance.
Wow, that's amazing. It's like a psychological reset button for them. But will it last?
The author suggests repeating the exercise several times, over a few days, and eventually he claims that the horse will lie down, just by you touching their leg, or even by the motion of a stick.
That's incredible. It really shows how powerful these seemingly simple actions can be.
Yeah?
But I can't help but wonder about the ethics of it. Is it really fair to put a horse in that position, even if it's for their own good?
That's a valid concern. It's important to approach any training technique with sensitivity and awareness. But the author argues that this method, when done correctly and with compassion, is actually less stressful for the horse than other methods that rely on force or intimidation.
It's definitely something to think about. It seems like there's a fine line between using this technique effectively and humanely, and maybe crossing over into something that feels more coercive.
You're absolutely right. That's why it's so important to understand the principles behind these techniques, not just blindly follow them, and to always prioritize the horse's well-being.
Okay, that makes sense. So besides this one foot up method, what other intriguing techniques does he describe? You mentioned teaching a horse to lie down on command earlier. How on earth does that work?
It's actually less about force and more about clever use of pressure and release. You start by gently restraining one of the horse's front legs. Then you use a long strap attached to the other front leg, and a surcingle that's a wide band that goes around their body to control their movements.
I'm picturing this in my head, but I'm having trouble visualizing it. So you're basically guiding them into a lying down position.
Exactly. It's a subtle dance of applying pressure on the strap and leaning against their shoulder to shift their weight. The key is to do it gradually, giving them time to figure out what you want.
I can't imagine a wild horse just giving in like that. Don't they resist?
Of course, there's some initial resistance, but eventually they figure out that fighting just makes it more uncomfortable. The author says in about 10 minutes, most horses will lie down, either out of exhaustion or a sense of giving up.
Okay, I have to admit that's pretty impressive. But what's the point of teaching a horse to lie down? Is it just a cool trick?
It's much more than that. It's about establishing trust and dominance in a way that doesn't involve violence. Once they're down, you can handle their legs, touch them all over, things they might never let you do before. It's like they enter the state of complete submission. And from there, you can build a foundation of trust and respect.
It's like you're saying, look, I could force you into this position, but I'm going to let you figure it out on your own. It's almost like a mental challenge for them.
Exactly. And by choosing to lie down, they're essentially choosing to submit to your leadership. It's a powerful moment of connection.
Wow, that's fascinating. This is making me rethink everything I thought I knew about horse training. What other techniques do we want to cover? I know we briefly mentioned teaching a horse to follow you.
Yes. That's a great example of how positive reinforcement can be just as effective as pressure and restraint.
I'm all ears. How do you teach a horse to follow you willingly? I'd imagine it involves treats.
Treats can definitely help, but the core of the technique is about building positive associations. It starts in a controlled environment like a stable. You basically lead the horse with the halter, using a long whip to tap them gently on the hindquarters to encourage them to stay close.
So the whip isn't about punishment. It's more like a gentle nudge.
Exactly. And you're constantly using your voice, "Come along, boy," in a soothing tone. Plus, every time they come near you, give them lots of petting and praise. It's about associating being near you with positive experiences.
I can see how that would work. Horses are smart. They pick up on patterns quickly. But how do you move beyond the stable? I can't imagine a horse just following me down the street.
You'd be surprised. Once they're reliably following you in the stable, you can gradually move to a larger area, like a paddock, and eventually even out on the road. The author says they'll learn to run after you when they see you with the whip, just out of eagerness to be by your side.
That's amazing. It really shows the power of positive reinforcement. Okay, so we've covered approaching a wild horse, haltering them, Getting them used to touch, and even teaching them to lie down and follow. What about teaching them to stand still? That seems like a pretty basic but important skill.
Absolutely. And it builds on the previous technique. Once they're used to following you, you start by gentling them all over, gradually working your way around them in a circle.
What happens if they move? Do you scold them?
Not at all. A quick tap with the whip puts them back in the exact spot they moved from. But if they stand still, they get lots of petting and praise.
So it's all about consistency and rewarding the behavior you want. Kind of like training a dog, but on a much larger scale.
You got it. And as they get better at standing still, you gradually increase your pace as you walk around them, making the circle wider and wider. Eventually, they learn to stand still no matter where you are, because they've learned that's what earns them the most positive attention.
Wow, this is all so fascinating. It really challenges the stereotype of horse training as being all about brute force and dominance. This author seems to be saying that it's about understanding, patience, and building a true partnership.
Exactly. And that's what makes his approach so relevant even today. It's about building a relationship based on trust and communication, not dominance and fear.
It makes you wonder how many so-called difficult horses
Uh-huh.
are just misunderstood. Maybe they're just reacting to our lack of understanding of their language.
That's a really profound thought. And it goes beyond horses. Think about any relationship where there's conflict. How often is it simply a result of miscommunication or a failure to understand the other person's perspective?
That's a powerful insight. It seems like this author wasn't just a horse whisperer. He was a master of communication and understanding in general. It's interesting as we've been exploring these techniques, it's really struck me how much of this book is about more than just training horses. It's almost like a philosophy for understanding and communicating with any living being.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. What's so fascinating about this author is that he seems to have tapped into some timeless principles. He's urging you to consider the horse's perspective, their instincts, their fears, and that's incredibly relevant to any relationship where you're trying to guide or influence another being.
It's like he's saying, stop trying to impose your will and start paying attention to what the other party is actually experiencing.
Precisely. And think about how many conflicts arise, not from malice, but from this simple lack of understanding. We assume others think like us, react like us, and when they don't, we get frustrated, maybe even resort to force.
Which with a horse obviously could have some pretty serious consequences. But I'm realizing now that it applies to so many other situations too.
Exactly. Think about dealing with a frustrated child, managing a team at work, or even negotiating a peace treaty. If we approach these situations with a mindset of taming rather than understanding, we're setting ourselves up for failure.
So what does this all mean for us as listeners? What can we take away from this deep dive into 19th century horsemanship that applies to our own lives?
Well, I think the key takeaway here is this. Before you try to lead, influence, or even just argue with someone, take a moment to consider their perspective. What are their instincts, their fears? What might they be misinterpreting?
It's like that saying, seek first to understand, then to be understood.
Exactly. And that shift in mindset from control to understanding, that's where real connection happens, whether you're dealing with a 1,200-pound animal or another human being.
It's pretty incredible that a book on horse training from the 1800s can offer such profound insights into human nature. So before we wrap up this deep dive, any final thought-provoking questions for our listeners to ponder?
Here's one. If we accept that horses aren't inherently rebellious, but simply reacting to their understanding or misunderstanding of our commands, what does that tell us about our own reactions to the world? How much of our own rebellion, our resistance to change or new ideas, stems from fear, from not fully grasping the situation?
Ooh, that's a good one. It's making me think about all those times I dug in my heels, only to realize later I was reacting out of fear, not logic.
Precisely. And if we can recognize that pattern in ourselves, maybe we can approach those situations with more curiosity, more willingness to listen, and ultimately more openness to change.
Well, I think that's a fantastic note to end on. It seems like the lessons we can learn from horses go far beyond the stable.
Absolutely. And maybe that's the most important takeaway of all, that by observing and understanding these magnificent creatures, we can gain valuable insights into ourselves and how we navigate the world.
Well said. Well, thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It's been a fascinating journey.
My pleasure. It's always rewarding to explore these hidden gems of wisdom and see how they connect to our lives today.
And to all our listeners out there, we hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought. Until next time, happy trails.
You can download the book for free from our website.